The frigid grip of the ocean enveloped him. John Mac McMillan, ex-Navy SEAL, watched in disbelief as the stern lights of his own boat, the Sea Serpent, rapidly receded into the inky blackness. A searing pain shot through his left shoulder, a stark reminder of the force with which he'd been thrown overboard. He treaded water, the vast, indifferent expanse of the sea stretching around him. The only sound, the rhythmic slosh of the waves against his ears. The speck of light on the horizon grew smaller, then vanished, leaving him in a world of oppressive dark. Just moments before, the scene had been disturbingly calm. Mark, the supposed leader of their salvage operation, had stood on the deck, his silhouette stark against the glow of the cabin. His eyes, usually alight with a calculating glint, were now cold, empty, devoid of any flicker of human connection. "You're a liability, Mac," Mark had stated, his voice flat, emotionless, cutting through the night air. "We don't need you holding us back anymore." The words hung heavy, a death sentence delivered with chilling nonchalance. Then, with a sudden, brutal shove, Mac was propelled into the churning water. Kevin and Dave, the other two members of their crew, stood like silent sentinels, their faces blank, reflecting nothing of the shock or horror that should have been etched there. They watched, impassive, as their partner, their friend, was cast adrift. Mac didn't scream. He didn't beg. The shock of the cold water was immediate, but his years of rigorous training kicked in. He surfaced, shook his head to clear the water from his eyes, and took a deep, controlled breath. He watched them go, a single, potent thought cutting through the initial haze of disbelief. They made a terrible mistake. It was a quiet, internal declaration, a promise whispered to the vast, indifferent ocean. The vast, dark ocean stretched around him, an endless, featureless canvas of liquid despair. The waves, initially gentle, were beginning to pick up, their rhythmic undulations growing more insistent. He could already feel the chill of the water seeping into his bones, a cold embrace that promised hypothermia and eventual surrender. There was no mistaking their intent. They had meant for him to die, to vanish without a trace, swallowed by the insatiable maw of the sea. They thought they were rid of him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As if in response to the heinous act, the distant sky began to darken further. Storm clouds, ominous and heavy, gathered on the horizon, painting the already foreboding scene with an even deeper shade of purple-black. Lightning flickered in the distance, a silent, menacing promise of the tempest to come. He was alone, miles from any discernible shore, and a storm, a true force of nature, was brewing. The vastness of the ocean, the impending weather, and the brutal betrayal formed a terrifying triumvirate against him. He was just a man in the water, but he was also a man forged in the crucible of the U.S. Navy SEALs, a man who had faced death and stared it down more times than he could count. He would not yield. Not now, not ever. Before we continue with Mac's incredible journey, remember to subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more untold stories of resilience and survival to light. Mac's roots ran deep, anchored in the sun-drenched, salt-laced soil of Key West, Florida. It was a small, vibrant fishing community, a place where the scent of brine and fresh catch mingled with the exhaust of diesel engines. His family had been there for generations, their lives inextricably woven into the rhythm of the tides and the bounty of the sea. Growing up, the salty air was his constant companion, the distant cry of gulls his morning alarm. Every day was a symphony of boat horns, the clatter of ice being loaded onto trawlers, and the easy banter of fishermen preparing for another day's haul. Everyone knew everyone. A double-edged sword that offered both unwavering support and the sharp sting of judgment for those who strayed from the unspoken codes of the community. His days were a blur of purposeful activity, each one a lesson in the unforgiving yet generous nature of the ocean. From the tender age of 5, his grandfather, a man whose skin was as weathered and tough as old rope, had taken him out on his fishing skiff. It was there, amidst the rocking waves and the vast expanse of blue, that Mac learned to read the currents, anticipate the tides, and understand the subtle language of the sea. He learned to mend nets, bait hooks with practiced ease, and navigate by the stars long before he ever saw a compass. The early morning starts were brutal, often before dawn, but they fostered a camaraderie on the docks that was unlike anything he'd ever known. It was honest, hard work, the kind that built character and a deep respect for nature's power. His family was the bedrock of his existence. His grandfather, gruff on the outside but with a heart as vast as the ocean he loved, instilled in Mac a profound sense of resilience. "The sea don't care if you're tired, boy," he'd often grumble, his eyes twinkling. "It only cares if you're ready." This mantra became a guiding principle for Mac. The community, too, played a vital role, a sprawling extended family that rallied together in times of need, yet held a watchful eye on newcomers, ever wary of those who didn't pull their weight or respect the delicate balance of their way of life. Mark, Kevin, and Dave were not from Key West. They were outsiders, drawn to the Keys a few years prior by the siren song of easy money, whispered tales of lucrative salvage operations, and the booming charter fishing industry. They arrived with a certain slickness, a flashiness that contrasted sharply with the understated practical demeanor of the locals. Mark, in particular, was always talking about big scores, grand schemes, and shortcuts to wealth. Mac, initially, saw their ambition as a positive trait, albeit tempered with a slight unease about their seemingly insatiable hunger for quick profits. He observed their eagerness for shortcuts, a stark contrast to the patient, methodical approach he'd been taught. Early tensions began to surface, subtle at first, like ripples on calm water. Mac recalled instances where Mark would consistently try to cut corners on boat maintenance, dismissing critical repairs as unnecessary expenses. He'd push the crew, including Mac, to take unnecessary risks to chase a bigger haul, often ignoring safety protocols that Mac, with his military background, held sacred. Kevin and Dave, for their part, usually deferred to Mark, their silence often interpreted as compliance. They rarely questioned his judgment, even when it seemed reckless. Mac often found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the voice of caution, the one who pointed out the potential dangers. This role, he quickly realized, Mark deeply resented. Mark saw Mac's prudence not as wisdom, but as an impediment, a drag on his relentless pursuit of profit. These small, accumulating frictions were the first cracks in what would eventually become an irreparable chasm. The fissures in their relationship widened, transforming from subtle cracks into gaping chasms. Mac vividly recalled a particularly harrowing incident that highlighted Mark's reckless disregard for safety and his insatiable need to be perceived as the hero. They were out on a charter, a group of tourists eager for a deep-sea fishing adventure, when a squall, unpredicted and ferocious, descended upon them with terrifying speed. The sky turned an angry, bruised purple. The waves rose into churning mountains, and panic began to ripple through the passengers. It was Mac's quick thinking, his years of Navy SEAL training kicking in without conscious thought, that ultimately saved them all. He instinctively took control, barking orders, securing loose gear, calming the terrified passengers, and expertly maneuvering the boat through the treacherous swells until they found a temporary, safer lee. He had risked his own life, putting his skills to the ultimate test, and brought everyone back to shore, shaken but safe. Yet, instead of gratitude, Mark's reaction was a chilling display of insecurity and resentment. Later, in the relative calm of the dock after the relieved passengers had disembarked, Mark had casually dismissed Mac's heroic actions as just doing his job, a cynical wave of his hand. He even subtly implied that Mac had exaggerated the danger, painting himself as more of a savior than was truly necessary. It was a calculated slight, a deliberate attempt to diminish Mac's contribution and ensure that the spotlight of heroism remained firmly fixed on Mark himself. This wasn't an isolated incident. Mark always had to be the hero, the one in charge, the one whose decisions, no matter how flawed, were unquestionable. Then there was the money. A substantial sum Mac had loaned Mark to upgrade their primary fishing vessel, the Sea Serpent. The agreement was clear. Repayment would come from future earnings, a percentage of every successful charter and salvage operation. Mac, ever the loyal partner, trusted Mark, believing in their shared venture. But as the months turned into a year, Mark consistently found excuses not to pay. It was always cash flow problems or unexpected expenses, a litany of financial woes that somehow never seemed to impede Mark's own lavish spending. While Mac waited patiently for his investment to be returned, Mark was frequently seen sporting new, expensive watches, upgrading his personal vehicle, and acquiring the latest, flashiest fishing gear for himself, often gear that was entirely unnecessary for their operations. The hypocrisy was galling, a blatant betrayal of trust that gnawed at Mac. The abuse and negligence escalated. Mac remembered another alarming incident where Mark, in a desperate bid to meet a tight deadline for a lucrative salvage job, knowingly took the Sea Serpent out to sea with a faulty engine part. Mac, having noticed the issue during pre-departure checks, had vehemently protested, pointing out the clear and present danger to everyone on board, let alone the potential for catastrophic equipment failure miles offshore. The argument was heated. Mark's face contorted with anger. He lashed out, calling Mac too cautious, overly paranoid, and even past his prime, implying that Mac's military discipline had somehow made him weak or risk-averse. The accusation stung, yet Mac held his ground, only relenting when Mark, with a smirk, dared him to jump ship if he was so scared. Mac stayed, not out of fear of Mark, but out of a deep-seated sense of responsibility for the safety of the crew and the preservation of the vessel. He knew that if something went wrong, he would be the one to fix it. These events, and a multitude of others like them, slowly but inexorably built up, eroding the foundation of their partnership. Mac began to see Mark not as a friend or even a business partner, but as a manipulative opportunist, a man who viewed others as mere tools to be used and discarded when their utility expired. He observed, with growing dismay, how Kevin and Dave, once individuals with their own opinions, had become increasingly subservient to Mark, their voices silenced, their loyalty seemingly absolute, even when Mark's decisions were clearly flawed or outright dangerous. The initial betrayal, the shocking act of being thrown overboard, wasn't a sudden, impulsive act of violence. It was, Mac realized, in the cold, unforgiving water, the brutal, inevitable culmination of a long, toxic, and utterly broken relationship. It was the final, unforgivable act in a partnership that had died a slow, painful death long ago. The unforgivable line was finally crossed during a particularly challenging salvage operation. They had discovered a promising wreck, a Spanish galleon rumored to hold a significant cache of gold and jewels. The allure of such a prize was intoxicating, and Mark, ever the opportunist, was practically salivating at the prospect. He immediately began pushing for aggressive, high-risk recovery methods, insisting on cutting corners on safety protocols to retrieve the most valuable artifacts as quickly as possible. Mac, drawing on his extensive SEAL training and his intimate, almost instinctual knowledge of the sea's dangers, warned him repeatedly of the extreme peril such tactics posed. The currents in that particular area were notoriously unpredictable. The structural integrity of the ancient wreck was questionable, and the weather, though calm at the moment, had a habit of turning treacherous without warning. Mark, however, was deaf to Mac's warnings. He scoffed, his face twisted in a sneer of dismissive contempt. "You're always seeing ghosts, Mac," he'd spat, his voice laced with impatience. "We're not in the Navy anymore. This is real money, not some training exercise." He pushed forward, overriding Mac's objections, ignoring the meticulous safety plans Mac had drawn up, and ordering the crew to proceed with his reckless scheme. The operation, predictably, went disastrously wrong. A sudden shift in the current, combined with the unstable structure of the wreck, caused a section of the galleon to collapse. A valuable piece of recovery equipment, an expensive remotely operated vehicle, was lost to the depths, crushed beyond retrieval. Worse, Kevin, caught in the unexpected collapse, sustained a serious injury to his leg, a deep gash that bled profusely and left him in agonizing pain. It was a direct consequence of Mark's negligence, his arrogant dismissal of Mac's expertise. Later, after they had limped back to shore, Kevin receiving emergency medical attention, Mac confronted Mark directly. His voice was low, strained with a mixture of anger and profound disappointment. He wasn't yelling, but his words carried the weight of years of shared experience and a deep personal concern. "You're going to get someone killed, Mark," Mac had stated, his gaze unwavering. "Or worse, you're going to get us killed. You need to change. You need to respect the ocean, and you need to respect the lives of the men working for you." It wasn't a plea. It was a stark, unvarnished warning, an attempt to make Mark see the gravity of his actions before it was too late. Mac genuinely believed, in that moment, that Mark could still be reasoned with, that he might yet grasp the fundamental truth of responsible seamanship. But Mark simply laughed in his face. It was a harsh, derisive sound that grated on Mac's nerves, devoid of any genuine humor. He leaned back, a smug expression on his face, and called Mac an old man and washed up, a man whose glory days were long past. "I don't need lectures from a guy who peaked 20 years ago," Mark sneered, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement. Kevin and Dave, though quiet and visibly uncomfortable, offered no defense for Mac. They stood silently by, their faces unreadable, effectively endorsing Mark's cruel words through their inaction. It was a moment of profound realization for Mac. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. Mark was incorrigible, beyond reason, beyond redemption. It was clear then. Mac realized, with a chilling certainty, that he could no longer trust Mark, not with his life, not with his livelihood, not with anything. The partnership, once built on shared dreams and mutual respect, was irrevocably shattered. Mac understood that continuing to work with Mark was not just dangerous, it was suicidal. He decided, then and there, that he had to cut ties. But he knew Mark wouldn't let him go easily, especially with the substantial sum of money Mark still owed him. Mark was not one to relinquish control or assets without a fight. Quietly, meticulously, Mac began to make plans to leave the partnership, to start his own charter business, a venture built on integrity, safety, and the genuine love of the sea that Mark had long since forgotten. He started gathering his resources, discreetly contacting old clients, sketching out business plans. He moved with the silent, calculated precision of a SEAL planning an extraction. But somehow, Mark found out. A loose word, an overheard phone call, a misplaced document. Mac never pinpointed how. This knowledge, Mac later realized, as he watched the lights of the sea serpent disappear into the gathering storm, sealed his fate, and led directly to the ultimate act of betrayal. As the distant lights of the sea serpent vanished into the encroaching darkness, leaving him utterly alone in the vast, indifferent ocean, Mac's military training, honed over decades of relentless pressure and impossible odds, kicked in with an almost instinctual precision. There was no room for panic, no time for despair. His mind, a finely tuned instrument of survival, immediately began to assess the brutal realities of his situation. He was in the water, miles from any discernible landmass. He estimated the nearest key, a remote, uninhabited sliver of land, to be roughly 60 miles away. A daunting, almost impossible distance for even the most seasoned swimmer. The gathering storm, a looming threat that had been building on the horizon, was now an undeniable force, its oppressive weight pressing down on him. His shoulder, screaming in protest from the sudden violent shove, throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder of the betrayal. His resources were laughably minimal. The clothes on his back, a waterproof watch that now served as his only connection to the passage of time, and the sheer, unyielding will to survive that had defined his entire life. He began to swim, not in a desperate, frantic flailing, but with the steady, measured stroke he had perfected during countless hours in Bud-S, the grueling basic underwater, demolition touch SEAL training. Each stroke was deliberate, conserving precious energy. He used the rhythm of the ocean, allowing the swells to carry him, to assist his progress rather than fighting against them. His mind, a vast repository of survival knowledge, began to sift through every lesson learned, every endurance swim pushed to the brink, every moment of mental toughness forged in the crucible of SEAL training. He focused on small, achievable goals, breaking down the seemingly insurmountable task into manageable segments. Swim for an hour, then allow himself a 5-minute rest, treading water, before reevaluating his course and energy levels. It was a strategy of incremental victories, a way to keep the overwhelming scale of his challenge from crushing his spirit. The suspense, already a palpable presence in the darkening waters, intensified as the storm finally unleashed its fury. The waves, once merely challenging, transformed into monstrous towering walls of water that crashed down upon him with bone-jarring force. He described the terrifying sensation of being tossed around like a discarded toy, utterly at the mercy of the tempestuous sea. The rain, driven by gale-force winds, lashed at his face, blinding him, making it impossible to see beyond the immediate, churning chaos. Thunder boomed overhead, a deafening drumbeat accompanying the relentless assault of the waves, while streaks of lightning momentarily illuminated the terrifying expanse of the angry ocean, revealing its vastness and his own minuscule presence within it. He fought a multi-front battle against the elements and his own physiology, the insidious creep of hypothermia as the water's chill seeped into his bones, the relentless pangs of dehydration threatening to sap his strength, and the crushing weight of despair that threatened to engulf his mental fortitude. In those moments of profound isolation and struggle, he found himself talking aloud, a desperate attempt to maintain a connection to reality, to ward off the encroaching madness of utter solitude. He spoke of his family, of the injustice that had been wrought upon him, of the faces of Mark, Kevin, and Dave. Their blank stares burned into his memory. He used the white-hot anger that simmered beneath his survival instincts as fuel, converting the rage into an enduring, propelling force. Then, a flicker of hope in the maelstrom. Through the driving rain and spray, a dark shape appeared, bobbing erratically on the waves. A piece of debris, a floating pallet, likely torn from some unfortunate vessel caught in the storm. With a renewed surge of effort, he managed to reach it, his numb fingers scrabbling for purchase. Clinging to the makeshift raft, he allowed himself a few precious hours of rest, a brief respite from the relentless swimming. It was a chance to conserve energy, to gather his thoughts, and to plan his next move. He used the brief lulls in the storm, when the clouds parted just enough, to search for the stars, his ancient navigators. He remembered the constellations, their positions, and used them to maintain his bearing, guiding himself towards the remote key he had fixed in his mind. He recalled the complex patterns of the currents in this particular part of the Gulf, using his intimate knowledge of the sea to his advantage, allowing them to assist his journey rather than impede it. He was not merely a man swimming for his life. He was an experienced navigator, a highly trained operative executing a mission. Every stroke, every breath, every moment of observation was a calculated move in his silent plan for survival and ultimately for reckoning. The silent plan, meticulously executed stroke by stroke, breath by breath, eventually brought Mac to the shores of that remote, uninhabited key. Exhausted, battered, and on the brink of collapse, he dragged himself onto the sand, the sheer will that had propelled him for 60 miles, finally allowing him a moment of respite. Days later, a local fisherman, venturing further out than usual, due to a change in the migratory patterns of certain fish, spotted Mac's emaciated form on the desolate beach. The fisherman, a weathered old man named Carlos, who had seen his share of strange things on the water, found Mac barely conscious, delirious, but alive. Mac's story, delivered in ragged whispers, was almost unbelievable. A man swimming over 60 miles through a hurricane after being deliberately abandoned at sea, yet his physical state, the raw, chafed skin, the deep lines of exhaustion etched onto his face, and the undeniable fact of his survival against impossible odds, lent a terrifying credibility to his tale. Carlos, a man of the sea himself, knew the ocean's treachery and its capacity for both cruelty and miracles. He nursed Mac back to health, providing food, water, and a quiet, unquestioning sanctuary. Mac, however, did not rush to the police immediately. His years in the Navy SEALs had taught him that direct confrontation wasn't always the most effective path to justice, especially when dealing with individuals as cunning and ruthless as Mark. He knew Mark would have already spun a narrative, a carefully crafted lie to cover his tracks. Instead, Mac began to quietly activate his old contacts, a discreet network of ex-military personnel and trusted local fishermen, men and women who owed him favors, respected his past, or simply understood the unwritten laws of the sea. He began to gather information, piecing together the story of what had transpired since his disappearance. He learned that Mark, Kevin, and Dave had indeed wasted no time. They had spread a convincing story throughout the community. Mac, the old man, had fallen overboard in the storm, a tragic accident. They claimed they had searched for hours, their voices laced with feigned sorrow, their faces masks of concern. They had even gone so far as to initiate the process of collecting insurance on the lost Mac, a final, cynical act of betrayal designed to profit from his presumed death. The audacity of their scheme, the callous disregard for his life, fueled a cold, quiet rage within Mac, a rage he channeled into meticulous planning. Once fully recovered, his body mended and his mind sharper than ever, Mac made his move. He didn't confront them in a back alley, nor did he seek a violent retribution. Instead, he employed the very intelligence-gathering techniques he had mastered in the SEALs. He used his network to dig deeper, unearthing not just evidence of his abandonment, but a long trail of Mark's illegal activities. Smuggling operations hidden within legitimate fishing halls, elaborate insurance fraud schemes, and a litany of regulatory violations. He found old crew members Mark had exploited, suppliers he had cheated, and even whispers of other accidents that had befallen those who stood in Mark's way. Mac didn't just have proof of his own attempted murder. He had a comprehensive dossier on Mark's entire criminal enterprise. With irrefutable evidence in hand, Mac didn't go to Mark. He went to the authorities, presenting his meticulously compiled case. He also quietly disseminated parts of the information through his network, allowing the truth to ripple through the close-knit fishing community. The community, which had once respected Mark for his perceived success, for his flashy boat and his confident demeanor, slowly began to turn on him. The whispers of Mac's miraculous survival, combined with the damning evidence of Mark's deceit and criminality, painted a picture too clear to ignore. The local authorities, armed with Mac's undeniable proof, moved swiftly. One morning, as the sun rose over the Key West harbor, Mark, Kevin, and Dave were arrested. The community watched, a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction on their faces, as the men were led away in handcuffs. The Sea Serpent, the very boat that had carried Mark away from the man he left for dead, was impounded as evidence, its once proud hull now a symbol of Mark's downfall. His business was ruined, his reputation shattered beyond repair. In that moment of reckoning, as Mark was being escorted to the police cruiser, his eyes, wild and disbelieving, scanned the crowd. He caught sight of Mac, standing quietly at a distance, his face impassive, a quiet, knowing look in his eyes. It was then, in that final, crushing instant, that Mark truly realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had underestimated the man he left for dead. He had forgotten the resilience, the unwavering determination, and the lethal intelligence of a Navy SEAL. He had tried to drown Mac, but instead, Mac had risen from the depths to ensure Mark's own ruin. The legal consequences for Mark, Kevin, and Dave were swift and severe. Faced with Mac's meticulously gathered evidence, which painted an undeniable picture of attempted murder, insurance fraud, and a pattern of illicit activities, the prosecution built an airtight case. The community's testimony, once swayed by Mark's charisma, now solidified against him, confirming the insidious nature of his character and the extent of his deception. Mark, the architect of the betrayal, received the harshest sentence, a lengthy term in federal prison that effectively ended his life as he knew it. Kevin and Dave, his willing accomplices, also faced significant time behind bars, their lives shattered by their complicity and poor choices. Mac received reports, filtered through his network, of their grim existence within the correctional system, their once grand ambitions reduced to the daily grind of prison life. There was no joy in their downfall for Mac, only a quiet confirmation that justice, though sometimes delayed, had ultimately prevailed. Their arrogance and cruelty had led them to this inescapable fate, a consequence of underestimating the man they had tried to erase. Mac, however, did not dwell on vengeance or the misfortunes of his former associates. He had survived, and that was victory enough. With the legal proceedings concluded, he turned his focus entirely to rebuilding his own life, not just for himself, but for his family and the community that had embraced him once more. He poured his savings and the small settlement from the impounded sea serpent and Mark's other assets into establishing his own charter business. He named it the Unsinkable, a subtle nod to his harrowing ordeal and an enduring symbol of his resilience. His new venture was founded on principles that stood in stark contrast to Mark's deceitful practices. Ethical operations, unwavering safety standards, and a profound respect for the ocean and its creatures were the cornerstones of the Unsinkable. He personally oversaw every detail, from the meticulous maintenance of his new, sturdy vessel to the rigorous training of his small, hand-picked crew. His reputation, forged in the crucible of his survival and amplified by his integrity, spread quickly throughout Key West and beyond. People sought out the Unsinkable, not just for its exceptional service, but for the implicit trust they placed in Mac. They knew his story, and they knew that a man who had faced death and emerged stronger was a man who could be relied upon. He found peace on the water once more, a profound sense of belonging that had been temporarily marred by betrayal. The familiar rhythm of the waves, the salt spray on his face, the endless horizon, these were no longer reminders of a near-death experience, but rather affirmations of life, resilience, and renewed purpose. He reconnected deeply with his family, who had endured such anxiety during his disappearance. His grandfather, whose gruff exterior always hid a deep affection, looked at Mac with a newfound pride, recognizing the full embodiment of the resilience he had tried to instill. The community, which had always held a special place for him, now viewed him as a living legend, a testament to the indomitable human spirit. Children would gather on the docks to hear snippets of his incredible tale, their eyes wide with wonder, seeing in him not just a local hero, but a symbol of hope and unwavering strength. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, Mac understood that the ocean, which had so nearly claimed his life, had also become his greatest teacher. It had stripped away everything but his raw will to survive, forcing him to confront his deepest fears and discover an inner reservoir of strength he hadn't known existed. He often shared his story, not to boast, but to impart a powerful message of overcoming adversity. He would speak of how true strength wasn't merely about physical prowess, though that had certainly played a part in his survival. Instead, he emphasized the paramount importance of mental fortitude, the ability to endure, to adapt, to believe in oneself, even when all hope seemed lost. He spoke of knowing who you are at your core, understanding your values, and drawing strength from them when facing insurmountable odds. He would conclude by saying that the greatest revenge wasn't found in retribution, but in the profound act of survival and the thriving that followed. To live, to rebuild, to find joy and purpose after such a profound betrayal was the most potent message he could send. His life became a testament that even when others try to break you, when they cast you adrift in the darkest of storms, the human spirit, armed with resilience and an unyielding will, can not only endure, but can rise again, stronger and more purposeful than ever before. The ocean had tried to drown him, but instead it had cleansed him, leaving behind a man forged anew, an enduring symbol of hope against despair.